It was a stormy night when Ethan Walker, the billionaire's son, stumbled upon an old, dusty diary hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the attic of his family's sprawling mansion. The diary, with its worn leather cover and yellowed pages, had clearly been forgotten by time, but as Ethan opened it and began to read, what he found inside would forever change his understanding of his family's legacy and his own place in it. Who wrote the diary, and why had it been hidden for so long? Was this a mere relic, or was it a confession that could shatter everything Ethan thought he knew? Ethan Walker had always lived a life of privilege, growing up in a mansion that was more a palace than a home. The sprawling estate sat on the edge of a hill, overlooking the town where his father, Gregory Walker, had built an empire. Gregory was a self-made billionaire known for his ruthless business tactics, an empire built on tech innovations, real estate, and acquisitions. Ethan, the only child, had never had to worry about the kind of things most people did: finances, housing, career. His life was mapped out before him, dictated by the weight of his father's expectations and his family's legacy. On the surface, Ethan had everything: a prestigious education, a luxury car, designer clothes, and an endless stream of invitations to exclusive events. But despite the material abundance, Ethan often felt like an outsider in his own life. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was expected to live up to some ideal that was not his own. He admired his father's success, but found himself suffocating under the pressure to follow in his footsteps. Unlike his father, Ethan wasn't particularly interested in business or money. He had a passion for history, old artifacts, and forgotten stories, things that made him feel connected to something deeper than wealth. Yet, his father saw it as a distraction and never fully supported his son's interests. Ethan's relationship with his mother, Amelia, was strained as well. She was the embodiment of elegance and societal expectation, graceful, composed, always in control. But beneath the poised exterior, there was a noticeable distance between them. Amelia often played the part of the perfect mother, but her role as a wife to Gregory left little room for true emotional connection with Ethan. It wasn't that they were estranged, it was just that she seemed to live in a world where real feelings were secondary to appearances. Ethan had spent years living in the shadow of his family's wealth and expectations, trying to carve out his own path in a world that seemed to leave him no room for independence. But everything was about to change. The discovery came on an ordinary afternoon, one that Ethan thought would be like any other. After a heated argument with his father about his future, Ethan decided to take refuge in the attic of the mansion. It was a place he had often retreated to as a child, a space where he could escape the demands of the world below. It was dusty and cluttered, filled with forgotten objects, old furniture, boxes of trinkets, family portraits hidden in corners, and remnants of a past long gone. But it was here, amid the remnants of his family's history, that he found the diary. The book, buried beneath a pile of old books, caught Ethan's eye. It was oddly out of place among the other items, almost as if it had been intentionally hidden. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages had yellowed with age, but there was a sense of mystery about it. Who had it belonged to, and why was it buried in this forgotten part of the mansion? As Ethan sat down in the dusty attic, the sound of the storm raging outside and the smell of old wood in the air, he opened the diary, unaware that it would lead him into a labyrinth of secrets that no amount of money or status could shield him from. What lay between the pages would challenge his perception of his family and force him to question everything he had ever known about loyalty, truth, and the legacy he was meant to inherit. Ethan sat in the attic, his fingers trembling as he flipped open the diary. The first few pages were written in a neat, elegant script, much like the writing he had seen in old letters his grandparents had kept. But as his eyes scanned the words, he quickly realized this was no ordinary diary. The entries were personal, dark, and filled with secrets that seemed to be linked not only to his family's past, but to a history of power, betrayal, and guilt that no one had ever spoken of. The first entry was dated 1969, decades before Ethan's birth. It was signed with just a single name, Eliza. The words that followed were blunt, raw, and full of emotion. I have watched him grow, seen his ambition take root in a way that frightens me. He doesn't know how far he's willing to go for power. What will he sacrifice next? Ethan's curiosity deepened. Who was Eliza? His father had never mentioned an Eliza. Neither had his mother. Ethan paused, flipping ahead, the diary revealing more details that felt both eerie and too familiar. The entries grew increasingly uncomfortable to read. Eliza described a passionate affair with a man she called Gregory. Ethan's father, Gregory Walker, the man who had built the empire Ethan now stood to inherit. The diary's confessions were not just about a love affair. They hinted at betrayal, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. The entries spoke of Greg's insatiable drive to succeed and the cost it had on the people around him. It painted Gregory not as a successful, driven businessman, but as a man who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals, even at the expense of others. I will never forget the night I saw the look in his eyes after the deal went through. He was a different man, and I knew then that nothing would ever stop him. But I also knew I could never tell anyone about us. He would destroy me if I did. Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. His mind raced as he processed the implications of the words before him. The man he had admired, his father, the man who had built the empire Ethan was supposed to inherit, was not the person Ethan had thought him to be. Gregory Walker was more complex, more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The deeper Ethan read, the more unsettling the diary became. There were mentions of power struggles, manipulations, and deceit. It painted a picture of Gregory's rise to wealth through betrayal and cunning, taking advantage of vulnerable people to ensure his own success. It described moments when Eliza seemed to be complicit in his actions, yet also remorseful for the price they paid. It was clear there was more than one side to the story, and this version was one Ethan had never been told. Ethan spent hours in the attic, reading the diary cover to cover. With every page, the conflict in his heart grew stronger. Who could he trust? Could he trust his father, or had he been living in a web of lies? As he sat there, wrestling with the weight of the truth, his mother Amelia entered the attic unexpectedly. Her heels clicked sharply on the wooden floor as she stepped into the dimly lit room. "Ethan," she said, her voice cold but laced with concern. "What are you doing up here?" Ethan quickly closed the diary, but not before Amelia's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of the cover. She froze, her gaze locking onto the leather-bound book in his hands. It was as though the air had been sucked out of the room. Amelia's face drained of color, her posture stiffening. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice tight. Ethan hesitated, looking at his mother, the woman who had always presented herself as poised and composed, the woman who had never shown any sign of vulnerability. But now, as he saw the way her eyes flickered with unease, a new realization hit him. She had known more than she had let on. "What is this, Mom?" Ethan asked softly, holding up the diary. "Who is Eliza? Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" Amelia swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a thin line. She crossed the room slowly, her steps measured, and took a seat beside him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Ethan's mind was racing, his pulse quickening as the pieces of his family's past started to come together, but still left so many questions unanswered. Finally, Amelia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eliza was someone your father loved before he married me. She was part of his past, a past that I chose to leave behind. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His mother's words were chilling in their simplicity. He had never heard this story, not in the way his mother was now telling it. "So, you knew about the affair?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," Amelia replied. "I knew about Eliza, about their relationship. I knew about everything. But I married your father anyway because I believed in what we could become together. I thought we could build a future, and I made peace with his past." Ethan felt as though the ground beneath him was slipping away. All this time, he had viewed his parents as the epitome of success, of love, and of unity. But now, the foundation of his family's legacy seemed to crumble. His father's empire, his mother's stoic demeanor, all of it felt hollow, built on compromises he hadn't understood. "I wanted to protect you from all of this," Amelia continued, her voice trembling for the first time. "I never wanted you to know how we got here. But your father, he was willing to go to great lengths, Ethan. He thought he could control everything, but he couldn't control the past." Ethan was silent for a moment, processing the emotional weight of his mother's words. "What do you mean by control the past?" he asked. Amelia's face tightened. "Your father tried to bury everything, Ethan. He buried his mistakes, buried the people he had hurt along the way, and he thought that by doing that, he could erase the pain, erase the guilt, but he couldn't. And now, it's all coming back." As the storm raged outside, Ethan's world seemed to collapse inward. His mother's confession, the diary's contents, and the cracks beginning to show in his family's carefully curated image left him questioning everything. Could he still love the man who had raised him, who had given him everything? Or was he now just another pawn in his father's game? But before he could process everything, a sound from below echoed through the mansion, his father's voice, loud and sharp, calling his name. "Ethan, where are you?" His pulse quickened as he stood, feeling a cold rush of uncertainty. He knew that this confrontation was inevitable. It was time to face Gregory Walker. Climax. Ethan stood at the top of the staircase, the leather-bound diary gripped tightly in his hands. His heart pounded in his chest, and the storm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside. He had heard his father's voice from downstairs, demanding his attention. Gregory Walker, the man who had built an empire from the ground up, was not one to be kept waiting, but Ethan had no intention of facing him until he had answers. He could feel the weight of everything that had been uncovered pressing down on him, the truth swirling like a vortex threatening to pull him under. The discovery of Eliza's diary had shattered the image he'd spent his entire life building around his family. The lies, the manipulation, the betrayal, it was all there, raw and undeniable. And now his mother's confession had forced Ethan to confront the truth head-on. He took a deep breath and descended the stairs slowly. Each step echoed through the mansion, a sound that seemed to resonate deeper within his chest as the distance between him and the inevitable confrontation with his father grew shorter. The mansion, which had always felt like a fortress of security, now felt like a cage, one that was closing in on him from all sides. Ethan had always been his father's heir apparent, groomed for success in the business world, but now that world seemed hollow. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he saw his father standing in the grand living room, his back to the door. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Gregory Walker was a tall, imposing figure, his sharp features hardened by years of making difficult decisions and battling the world. His wealth was evident in the opulence of the room, from the leather furniture to the expensive art hanging on the walls. "Ethan," Gregory called without turning around, his voice booming with authority. "I know you're there." Ethan hesitated, his fingers tightening around the diary. "I've been up in the attic," he said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of tension. "I found something." Gregory finally turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "What did you find?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, holding up the diary. "I found Eliza's diary, and I've read it." The silence between them was palpable. Gregory's face twitched for a moment, a flicker of emotion crossing his features before he quickly masked it with a scowl. "That's ancient history, Ethan," he said, his voice low, almost dismissive. "You don't need to concern yourself with things that happened before you were born." But Ethan could hear the defensiveness in his father's tone, the cracks beginning to form in the facade of control. "You were never going to tell me, were you?" Ethan continued, stepping closer. "You were never going to tell me about Eliza, about the affair, about everything you did to get here?" Gregory's expression darkened. "You think you know everything, don't you?" he said, his voice rising in anger. "You think you can just read a few pages and understand the sacrifices I've made? The world doesn't work the way you think it does. You'll learn that soon enough." Ethan shook his head, the frustration welling up inside him. "No, Dad, you don't get it. I don't want to inherit this empire. I want the truth. I want to understand who I really am, not just who you've made me think I am." Gregory's eyes flared with anger. He stepped toward Ethan, his large frame looming over him. "I've given you everything," he growled. "I built this empire with my blood, sweat, and tears. You think I did it just for myself? I did it for you, so you wouldn't have to struggle the way I did." Ethan stood his ground, his voice unwavering. "No, Dad. You built this empire for yourself, and I've been living in the shadow of that. You manipulated everyone, including me. Eliza didn't matter to you. All that mattered was power. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to an image that was built on lies." Gregory's eyes flickered with something, regret, guilt, maybe even fear, but it was fleeting. He was the kind of man who had built his empire by never showing weakness, by never letting anything or anyone get in the way of his ambition. But Ethan was no longer a child. He had seen through the illusion. "Enough!" Gregory snapped. "You don't know what it's like to sacrifice everything for success. You think this mansion, this fortune just appeared out of thin air. You think your mother and I didn't have to make deals with people we didn't like, didn't have to compromise our values to get here? You think I did all of this for you to sit around reading diaries and questioning everything?" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and the anger that had been building finally boiled over. "You never once asked what I wanted. You never asked me what I believed in. You only cared about controlling me, about shaping me into a version of yourself." Gregory's face twisted in fury. "You ungrateful little—" Before Gregory could finish his sentence, Ethan cut him off, his voice fierce. "Number, I'm done. I'm done living in your shadow. I'm done with the lies and the manipulations. I'm going to tell the world what I've found, and I'm going to expose everything. Your secrets, your betrayals, the truth about how you built your empire." For a moment there was silence. The air in the room seemed to freeze, heavy with tension. Gregory's face was ashen, his anger giving way to something else, something darker. "You think you're going to destroy me?" he whispered, his voice cold as ice. "You think people will believe you? I've built an empire, Ethan. I've made powerful enemies and allies. You can't take me down with a diary." Ethan felt the weight of his father's words, but he knew what he had to do. "I'm not doing this to destroy you, Dad. I'm doing it to free myself." His voice softened, the emotional weight of the moment sinking in. "I'm not you. I don't want to live the life you've built for me. I want to be my own person." Gregory took a step back, his eyes widening in disbelief. "You're throwing everything away. For what? To be some idealistic fool? You have no idea what you're dealing with." Ethan stared at his father, feeling a surge of clarity. This was the moment when he would no longer be controlled, no longer be a puppet in his father's world. He wasn't going to live a life based on lies, based on a legacy that had been built on others' suffering. "I don't know what I'm dealing with," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady. "But I know one thing. I'm not going to be like you." He turned on his heel, leaving his father standing there in the grand living room. The storm raged outside, but Ethan felt a strange sense of peace within himself. He had made his choice. The truth had been revealed, and the man who had once been his hero, his father, was no longer the figure he had once imagined. The road ahead would be uncertain, but it was his to walk. And as he stepped into the hallway, he knew that this was just the beginning of something bigger than himself, something that would redefine his life, his legacy, and his future. Resolution. The days after Ethan's confrontation with his father felt like a blur. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and success, now seemed oppressive. Every corner of the estate seemed to echo with the weight of the family secrets that had been unearthed. Ethan had decided to leave, to put some physical distance between himself and the empire that had been built on lies and manipulation. His first stop was a small apartment in the city, far from the marble floors and the inherited power of the Walker name. It wasn't much, just a modest space in a quiet neighborhood, but for Ethan, it felt like freedom. Here, there were no expectations, no legacy hanging over his head. It was just him and the world outside waiting to be discovered. For the first time, Ethan felt he could breathe without the pressure of being who his father wanted him to be. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Gregory Walker's empire began to show cracks. News outlets caught wind of Ethan's accusations. The story of Eliza's diary, the affair, and the corrupt practices in Gregory's rise to power began to unravel in the public eye. It didn't take long before former business partners, employees, and old allies came forward with their own stories. The facade that had shielded Gregory for decades was quickly crumbling. The world, which had once hailed him as a titan of industry, now began to question how much of his success had truly been earned. Gregory himself was forced into silence as his carefully crafted image of invincibility was shattered in a matter of weeks. People who had once adored him now saw him in a new light. His wealth, his influence, no longer seemed like the ultimate goal. The realization that his past had caught up with him in ways he couldn't control seemed to break him from within. Ethan didn't relish this downfall, though. He had not exposed his father's secrets out of revenge, but out of a need to reclaim his own truth. As the days passed, Ethan reflected more and more on what had happened, on the choices he'd made, and the decisions that had brought him to this point. He remembered the family dinners, the polished smiles, the glances his mother and father exchanged when they thought no one was looking. He realized that for years they had built a life of appearances rather than substance, but even in this, Ethan saw his own role. He had been complicit in living that lie, following the path his father had laid out for him without questioning whether it was the right one. It wasn't just about the business empire, the mansion, the wealth. It was about who he wanted to be, who he had the power to become. Ethan realized that by uncovering the truth, by refusing to live in the shadows of his father's mistakes, he had given himself the chance to break free from the cycle of deceit that had ruled his family for so long. Weeks later, Ethan received an unexpected phone call. It was from Amelia, his mother. Her voice was quieter than usual, but there was something in her tone, something he had never heard before. She wasn't just the stoic, composed woman who had always remained on the sidelines. "I want you to know I'm proud of you," she said. "You've done what I couldn't bring myself to do all these years. You've broken free." Ethan listened, the words sinking in. His mother had always seemed so emotionally distant, so focused on maintaining her image, that he never thought she would truly understand. But there was an honesty in her voice now, an acknowledgement of the complexity of their family and their shared history. For the first time, he felt as if she saw him, not just as her son, but as a person in his own right. "I don't know what the future holds," she continued, "but I've been thinking a lot lately. I think I've been living in your father's shadow for too long. I want to live for myself, for once." The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Ethan felt something shift, something that had been broken for years between him and his mother, but was now starting to heal. "I'm glad you're finding your way," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "And I'll be here, wherever that path takes us." Months passed, and the media frenzy around his father died down, but the effects lingered. Gregory Walker's empire was never quite the same, though his wealth remained intact. But he was no longer the same man he had been before the truth came out. Ethan could see that the man he had once feared, his father, was in some ways a shell of the person he had tried so hard to become. But this wasn't just about Gregory. This was about Ethan finally seeing through the illusion. Ethan's life took new turns. He started working with non-profits, focusing on causes he had always cared about but had never had the chance to pursue. His passion for history and forgotten stories led him to teach history at a local community college, where he was finally able to connect with others who shared his love for learning and discovery. He realized that wealth and power weren't the only things that could give life meaning. He found purpose in the simple act of helping others, of sharing what he had learned with people who appreciated it, not for status, but because it mattered. The mansion sat empty for a while, a relic of a past that no longer fit. Ethan's mother, too, eventually made a decision. She sold the house and moved into a smaller, more modest home on the outskirts of the city. The decision surprised everyone who knew her, but to Ethan, it was the first true step toward freedom for both of them. Ethan came to understand that what he had done, what he had uncovered, wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about destroying his father or his family's legacy. It was about living in a way that felt authentic. It was about accepting that the past could not be erased, but it didn't have to define who he was. In the end, Ethan realized that breaking away from the weight of his family's expectations had given him the space to rediscover himself. And while his father's empire continued to exist, Ethan no longer felt tethered to it. His own life was his to build, and it was no longer defined by the legacy of lies or the expectations of others. As he looked back on everything, the diary, the confrontation with his father, the decisions he had made, Ethan knew that he had chosen the harder path, but it was the one that had ultimately set him free. The moral of Ethan's story wasn't about the empire or the wealth. It was about courage. The courage to face the truth, the courage to challenge the status quo, and the courage to build a life that was entirely his own. And as he walked down a new path, he understood that true wealth didn't lie in gold or property. It lay in the freedom to live authentically, free from the chains of the past. As the storm clouds lifted, so too did the weight on Ethan's shoulders. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, it felt full of possibilities, and that, in itself, was worth everything.